Then my father passed in 2009, and I think I sort of had a real kind of spiritual awakening in the wake of his passing. I started reevaluating my life.
Hi, welcome back to Let Me Ask You Something, the weekly podcast where I, M.D. Pittman, talk to ordinary people about something extraordinary in their lives. Now, this week I talked to another former boss of mine, Kevin Aldridge. He is the opinion editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer, but he's also a pastor. So we talk about his passion for his religion and what got him to be a pastor. So, enjoy. Well, this is episode number 8 of Let Me Ask You Something, the podcast where I talk to ordinary, everyday people about something extraordinary that happens in their lives. And today we have Kevin Aldridge, the second former boss of mine that's been on this podcast. So I don't have many more former bosses, I don't think. so, so let me ask you something, Kevin. What got you into being a member of the clergy?
Man, that's a good question. I think throughout my life, there's always been sort of this calling, I think, that I've had that I wouldn't necessarily say that I recognized when I was younger as wanting to be in the ministry, but I've sort of have always been religious and sort of had a desire to always try to help people be the best versions of themselves. So, I grew up in a family where church was very important to us. My dad literally drugged me to church and Sunday school every week. If you're a kid who, sort of grows up in church, you don't really appreciate it as a kid, or even sometimes want to be there. But later on in life, you realize that it sort of gave you a great foundation. And I really got involved in church seriously kind of after I graduated from college and kind of went into professional life. I kind of decided that I didn't want to be one of those people who, like was on their deathbed and was like, oh, I kind of want to get my life right with God, and start doing the right things. And so I decided pretty early on that I wanted to, build on that foundation that my parents had given me when I was younger. And I started going back to church. And we had a minister at the church that I grew up in. He was a young guy. He was like a 30, mid to late 30s something preacher who was really about getting younger people in the church involved. And he was really the first pastor that I had who I felt like was really on my level and I could kind of talk to about things that I was going through at that point in time, being a mid 20 something man. And he and I connected and developed just a friendship and a mentorship. And, he really got me excited and interested in religion.
Yeah.
And then he moved on, and the person who replaced him kind of saw some of my gifts and talents that I was using in church. And she said, kind of challenged me. She said, hey, have you ever thought about being a minister? You've got a great gift and ability to teach. At the time, I was working with young people in our church doing little children's sermons and things like that. And my pastor at that time said, you have really good messages. And in fact, a lot of the adults in church get more out of the children's messages than the kids do, So have you thought about, thinking about whether or not you have a calling on your life? And at that time, I was kind of hesitant. I was like, I'm not a preacher. It's like, yeah, I enjoy working with the kids and I love studying, but didn't know whether that was the route that I wanted to go. And then then my father passed in 2009, and I think I sort of had a real kind of spiritual awakening in the wake of his passing. I started reevaluating my life and the role of God in my life. And I think, the calling became a little bit clearer after that. And I went back to my pastor and I said, you know what, I've been thinking about it and praying about it. And I think you're right. I think there's more God wants to do with me. And so I began the process of that. At that time, I started going through the ordination process and in 2012 got ordained as a minister, and the rest, as they say, is kind of history.
All right. Now, how does your profession, I mean, we're in the same profession. We are reporters. Former boss of mine, editor at the Journal News in Southwest Ohio. You're now the opinion editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer. But how does your job impact your pastoring?
Wow. Well, one good thing about being in the news industry, Mike, and you know this, is, we see a lot of, pretty much everything in the news business, from the good to the bad. And so um, being a journalist has actually kind of helped me in my ministry, because many of the things that we cover, many of the challenges and real life things that people are dealing with, I have a knowledge base from being a journalist that serves me well to be able to go in and talk about the issues that people are dealing with every day, and how we can marry that with our spirituality and find ways to make it through, whether you're talking about the pandemic or an economic collapse, or you name it, violence that we see in some of our communities, poverty. You have a unique perspective being a journalist that serves me well in the ministry. And now, particularly being an opinion editor, not only do I see what happens in the news, but I also kind of get some insight into people's minds and how they're thinking, and sort of what they're talking about. So I hear and see a lot of different perspectives, which I think, once again, helps me in the ministry as I shape messages and think about how I can help people develop better relationships with Christ and with each other. So being a journalist has actually sort of served me well in the ministry. Obviously, the job's a demanding job. Being a journalist is a demanding job, and so is being a pastor. Both of them are jobs that don't fit nicely in the 9 to 5
You're on call 24 hours, pretty much.
Exactly. So I sort of have two on-call jobs, if you will, and balancing that, can be difficult at times. I mean, there have been times where I've had to leave my journalism job to attend to the ministerial needs of folks in my congregation, or, we may have church events on Good Friday. We have, 7 last words, or Ash Wednesday. You have to do sort of the traditional rituals of your church. And sometimes that requires me to have to leave work for that. Fortunately, I've worked for companies and have had bosses who've been extremely flexible with me and accepting of this other calling that I have, and have allowed me to do that.
Yeah. Now, I'm trying not to get political on this podcast. I haven't had anybody with a political slant, or not necessarily a political slant, but have a political influence. But you're a pastor at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, for those who didn't know what AME stood for. How, with the climate today, with the race relations issues we face today as a country, how does that impact you? What do you do as a pastor to work through that, work with that?
Yeah, so I think as I look at the division, some of the politics, some of the issues of race that we have in the country, I think, we've all got opinions about that kind of stuff. But, the thing that I always do is try to take it back to what is the basis of what our religion and our belief in God is based on, and that's based on love. And so whenever I talk about what's going on in the world, the great thing I think we're missing in all of our discourse is sort of a love and a compassion and a humbleness and humility. When we're talking about these issues, our reluctance to sort of try to put ourselves in the foot of another person, or to offer forgiveness or chances at redemption. These are all things that, for those of us who are believers, are the essence of our faith, but we don't practice it every day. We don't practice it, in our politics, and in many ways, our politics does not allow for that, or give space for some of the things that we stake our beliefs on religiously. So the challenge that I always put forth to my to my congregation is we're not Republicans or Democrats first. We're not black or white first. We are supposed to be children of God first. And that if we're putting our faith, if we're putting our belief in Christ ahead of all of these other things, those are the things that should be leading us in the decisions that we make and the discourse that we have. But the challenge that we have today is too often we lead with the other identifiers, and regardless of what we might like to say or what we might like to posit, our spirituality and our faith often takes a back seat sometimes to our own personal opinions, our political views, and even sometimes our racial identities. And so I think if we could all learn, those of us who consider ourselves believers, to let the God in us speak before our politics or before our racial identities and these other things, we'd be a lot farther along on some of these issues.
So with that in the context here, what's the biggest challenge those in the religious community face today with getting that message out of being a good person, of what you just said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, churches all across the country, I mean, and this has been a trend that's been going on for years. It's not anything new, but it's people losing or losing membership. And it's not that people have lost spirituality. I think, what I come across when I talk to most people is you still have a lot of people who believe in God or in some higher power, but they've sort of lost faith in the traditional institution of the church. And there are a variety of reasons for that. I think primarily the church has to evolve. And in a weird way, the pandemic has forced a lot of churches to rethink church and how we go about trying to reach people, whether that's, live streaming sermons online or Zoom or Facebook Live or what have you. The challenge has always been, how do you get outside of the four walls of the church and meet people where they are? And I think that that churches are now, because of the pandemic and looking at ways to redo church, are going to have to reinvent themselves, because now not only do you have the people that you were losing before, but people who have been detached because of the lockdowns and the remote nature of things. You have to wonder, are they going to come back like physically into the buildings now? And so I think this is really a great time for us to sort of reevaluate and say, how do we get back out and meet people where we are? How do we get out of this comfort zone where we have been, where it said, hey, my church is on the corner of this street and we're open on Sundays and people come. I think, we have to get back into sort of the evangelism of going out and taking our message to people. And it's not
being
just
a little
about
bit more proactive. Yeah.
And it's not just about talking the message to either, Mike. It's about living the message. It's like, Marvin Lewis used to say, and when he was the coach of the Bengals, I see better than I hear, and I think, there's an old saying that people would rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. And so those of us who consider ourselves followers of Christ, when we go out, we got to live it. We got to live the sermons. We got to be the example. And that's the best way to get people to buy into what we're saying, is to see us living out in our everyday lives those things that we're preaching.
So how do you live that out? How do you, is it just going to community events and being visible, or is it more than just that? Is it more than just, is it being, involved in just the everyday activities in the community?
Yeah, I think, I wake up every morning, Mike, with this thought, like, how can I be a blessing to somebody? Like, and what I mean by that is, what can I do during the course of the day to make somebody's life better in some way, shape, or form? And that can be a variety of different things, whether that's speaking encouragement into somebody's life, whether that's, paying for their groceries at the grocery store, helping them pay a bill, or just, doing something during the course of the day that improves somebody's life, and looking for opportunities where I can make both small and big differences on a daily basis. It's those sorts of acts of kindness and really sort of living out the gospel of Christ that's going to make a difference in our lives. Like, all of us can do something every day. Like when we think about the challenges that impact our world and that we're dealing with, it's all overwhelming. We're all thinking like, what can little old me do to impact these huge national or world problems that we're dealing with? And each of us individually probably can't do a whole lot to change, the world, but each one of us can do something to change something in somebody's life that we know, or even people that we don't know, on almost a daily basis.
Yeah.
And if we're intentional about doing that, I think, that's one way that we can begin to live out and do the sorts of things that we're talking about. So if everybody woke up with that attitude every day that said, I'm going to bless somebody, throughout the course of this day, just do that. If everybody took that attitude, man, that could make a tremendous difference, even something as small as that.
That reminds me of something that's, to invoke another football coach, Tony Dungy. He always had said he had this philosophy of sweeping the corners, taking care of the little stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminded me of that philosophy as well, of just taking care of your own little world. I mean, that's how you take care of the big problems, is by taking care of the small problems.
That's right.
Which is on your neighborhood corner. So talk about the pastoral relationship that back years ago, you always knew or seen or saw that if somebody was injured or hurt, or they had this relationship with their pastor. Mm-hmm. Are we seeing less of that now? Is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this disconnect? Because there might be, in some circles or some churches, a less of a relationship with pastors?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think the pastors that I know and that I serve with, they try to be very attentive to the people that who are underneath them, in terms of, visiting people who are sick in the hospital, or who might, be in nursing homes, or even in their homes. That's a big part of our ministry, is sort of tending to the sick. But the thing that I always say is that, really good pastors and really good churches are create environments where it's not just the pastor who is doing those sorts of things, but it's the membership as a whole that's taking care of each other. That it's the community. One of the things that I kind of don't like about the ministry is that I get that pastors are the leaders of the church. They're sort of put, there in the head, and certainly they set the vision for the congregations. But this, because I tried to run the newsroom the same way when we worked together. It's like, yes, I'm in charge. The buck stops with me, but I want to empower the people who are working with me to have the autonomy to be able to go out and not only do their jobs, but feel the freedom to be creative, to do things to enhance, the newsroom and the newspaper overall. And I kind of feel like churches are the same way. That you've got to, train and create an environment in your churches where you're creating disciples who also go out and do the same work. It shouldn't just be the pastor who's attending to people who are sick and hurting in the church. Members should be rallying around, these folks as well. It should be a community rallying around it. And I think that, as pastors, we have to create environments in our churches where it's not about us standing up on a pedestal in front of everybody else and people looking at us to do everything, but how do we create congregations, communities within our congregations, where everybody feels that need and desire to tend to those who are sick and hurting in our congregations and in our communities. And I think that's an effective way. I think that's what we need to see more of, is because it's bigger. It's too big a job for one pastor. I mean, it's hard enough as a pastor to attend. If you got 200 people in your congregation, that's a tall order to try to tend to the needs of everybody and know what's going on in everybody's family and situation. You really do need a community of folks around you who are helping you do that.
So what is your take on mega churches, the big congregation churches where you have like stadium size seating, televised seating, where they're televised every Sunday, like I guess the old time televangelist. What are your thoughts on these mega churches that are around?
I don't really have I don't really have a problem with mega churches. I mean, I think that if you have a organizational setup and someone who is feeding the congregation in a way that it's drawing that, that many folks there, I think as long as the mission is pure and everything like that, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I think, we've got some mega churches in this area that are doing a lot of really, really great things, and sometimes they get a bad rap. But I also see the really good things that they're doing, and I think that again, it goes back to the substance of the message and what you're teaching people. I think as long as the gospel is pure, you should go where you feel like you're being fed and led to the Lord in a better life. So I'm not going to be one of these pastors who's at a smaller church who gets down on a mega church. As long as you're about God and the things of God and people are growing and you're making an impact, that's a good thing. Whether you're a small church or a mega church.
But wouldn't it be hard for the pastor at a mega church to do what you were talking about earlier about being attentive to some of the congregation's needs, like the personal needs? I mean, I don't know if I can remember 200 people's names, much less people at a mega church or all the family dynamics.
Yeah, certainly you don't have the one-on-one personal attention that you would get from a pastor at a smaller church with a smaller congregation. That's absolutely for sure. But I always say, really good churches have ministries within the ministry that people can connect to. And that gets to my point of sort of having a community where you've got other people underneath the pastor who are also providing that role. So, for example, when my wife and I met, she went to a much bigger church than I did, but they had a marriage ministry that we were a part of that we really formulated a great relationship with the associate pastor and his wife who were running that marriage ministry, and all of the people there. We sort of had our own little community within that ministry, within the larger church. That made us feel connected. So while we may not have had an intimate relationship with the pastor, which we were fortunate enough to do, we were among the people in the church who actually did have a personal connection with the pastor. But I think even folks who didn't still felt very much connected because there were arms within the church.
They were involved in other aspects of that church, the sub-communities. You talked a little bit about the pandemic and how it impacted. Can you talk a little bit more about how the pandemic is going to be changing what the church is and what won't change because of the pandemic? I mean, you talked about some of the need to get closer and expand the message out, but what can change because of this pandemic?
Well, I think the only thing that won't change for churches is the delivery of the word of God. I think everything else is absolutely going to change. Just as I said, I think that now that folks have been introduced into, video ministry, remote ministry, live streaming on Facebook, Zoom, those sorts of technological things, I think are going to be a part of churches now moving forward. Even if you have big in-person services, I think churches are still going to stream those services online. And that's a good thing because the internet really allows you to connect with people across long distances. What I found during the pandemic of doing my Facebook Live sermons is that people I went to college with who live on the West Coast, people who I formerly worked with who live in different places who could never get to Cincinnati or other places I've pastored to hear me preach, now get to hear me every Sunday if they want because I'm posted on there. And they can watch it at their leisure, almost like on demand. So you don't have to physically be there at 10 o'clock or 10:30 or wherever the church service is. You can now catch it on demand and still get that word wherever you want. Even me, like when you're preaching every Sunday, you don't get to hear other pastors that you admire a lot because they're preaching at the same time that you do. Now I get to hear a lot of my colleagues in the ministry preach, which is a great thing because if you're a pastor, you don't get many opportunities to get fed because you're always pouring out
Yeah.
to other people. So that's a great thing. And
Now,
so
with the street live streaming, don't you lose something though of not being there? I mean, isn't there something lost there?
I absolutely. I mean, look, there's no doubt that the the spirit, the energy that you get from preaching in front of a live crowd is different than when you're in front of a camera doing it. As a pastor, you don't get the sort of the immediate feedback of when you're in the when you're hitting on a right spot in a sermon and it's really generating with folks. You can kind of stay there, or when something's not quite coming over, to kind of get off of that and move quickly. Not having that personal interaction there is definitely a different environment, and I agree. I think the spirit of God is always present, but there's definitely something about being in personal fellowship with people that creates a different environment. I think church services are shorter now. I can specifically speak to the Black church experience, the AME church experience. We would sometimes have couple-hour church services on Sunday. Now with this sort of remote thing that we've been doing in the pandemic, services have been 45 minutes to an hour. I think the Catholics have always kind of had the hour mass sort of locked down.
Well, we had one pastor. We had one pastor at our Catholic church, Chet the Jet, because he always had 45-minute sermons, so or services. So, but yeah, hour and you're out, and you got the Catholic calisthenics. One thing I want to ask you, you mentioned this at the beginning, where you were actually the people in the church leaders saw you working with the kids and how do you get younger people in the church? Are we seeing a surge of younger people or not, or is there talk about it from your experience?
Yeah, we're not seeing younger people in the church. I mean, I think this is the trend that you sort of see, or at least that I see in the churches that I work with, is you have really young children who are in church. So kind of like me, when I said my dad was dragging me to church, there are those children who are at church because their parents bring them. Then there's sort of this transition period of once kids sort of get into high school or go away to college, you sort of lose them. And then there's not sort of a lot of that 25 to 35 age sort of young family categories in a lot of churches. And I think that's primarily because what you see in a lot of churches is either really young or sort of really old. There's not that sort of college age to early family type groups in a lot of churches. And I think that's a group that's ripe for the picking, but churches have to begin to understand, how do you attract those types of folks to church, and what are they looking for in their experiences? And so I think part of that is trying to figure out, what makes church worthwhile for those folks, or what sorts of things are they looking into. I think you've got to be actively doing things in churches that have ministries that are actually doing things. I think younger people actually want to be doing things. And so I think we've got to think outside of the box about how do you engage them and get them involved in doing some things that are going to excite them and make them feel good about the ministry.
So what are you guys doing to do that? What is your plan or strategy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of that is, you've got to be able to talk about and sometimes even offer things within the church service that might be a little bit different. I think a lot of the older members are used to sort of a traditional church service. So one of the things that we've started doing is having almost sort of like a separate service for our young people within the service, within our traditional service. So having a youth pastor there who can develop a service that might be a little bit more in tune with what kids are doing, something that's more interactive. It's more about involving them in the church service versus being preached to and lectured to. So it might look more like a discussion group than an actual formal pastor standing on a podium preaching the word. It might be more interactive. With younger kids, you might even incorporate some fun games or things of that nature to get to teach them while also keeping them entertained. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with, when you use that word entertainment, some people might think that that means you're getting too secular or outside of the holiness. That's not what I'm talking about. But look, here's the reality for all of us is all of us need to have our attention captured, right? We all need to be stimulated and intrigued to some way. And as long as the message of God is getting forth in a respectful, way, that we're not doing anything that's desecrating the word or sacrilegious, I think it's incumbent upon us to be creative about, how do we get the word of God across to people in relevant ways that are going to engage them. It's going to be compelling. And so, in many ways, I think about it, there are a lot of similarities between the newspaper business and ministry. For years, we got comfortable doing journalism in newspapers the way that we wanted to do them. And we were slow to recognize the technological changes with the internet, everything like that. And it was sort of like once the horse was out the barn, we were scrambling to try to catch up and have never really quite caught up. The church is kind of in a similar position, comfortable in the way in which we had always been doing church, that there was really kind of only one way to do church, and we were going to force people to take church that way. And when people were saying, well, hey, I'm going to different places, or I'm doing this, or there's these churches over here who are doing these different things, and traditional churches sort of refused to change, they were getting left behind. And I think now there's this recognition that, hey, look, we got to do something different, or we're going to die on the vine.
Yeah, no more our way or the highway type of thing, because they took the highway.
Exactly. You're exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right.
So anything else you want to make sure? What's the one biggest thing that you tell people when you talk about church with them? What's the biggest thing? Like if you're like your elevator pitch, not necessarily to go to church or your church, but if that topic comes up, what's your elevator pitch to somebody?
Wow, if that topic comes up, I mean, I think the first thing that I would say to folks is, to look at their life, and if they feel like their life is not what they want it to be, that something is missing and that they can't quite put their finger on what that is, but they want to find out what it is, that missing ingredient is generally God in your life. I always say it's one of those things, Mike, that until you've experienced, I always used to hear older people say this, and I never understood what they meant when they said, and until you experience God for yourself, it's hard to tell somebody else about what that experience is like. And the only way you get to know and have that relationship with God is to live it. You'll never have it if you don't commit yourself to it. And what I can tell people unequivocally is that that ever since that day I made the decision to turn my life over to God, I've had amazing, extraordinary things happen in my life. It doesn't mean everything has gone my way. It doesn't mean that every day has been a bed of roses, but my good days far outweigh the bad. And there's so many great things that have happened to me that are just inexplicable.
Can you give me an example of one of those?
Well, so here I'll give you the best example, and it'll combine, the two things that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. So at one point in my career, I worked at the Cincinnati Enquirer as a reporter. And I was there for 7.5 years. And for about 6.5 of those years, I had a great experience with the Cincinnati Enquirer. Then there was a regime change the last year that I was there. They brought in, new management. And for some reason, I fell out of favor with that new management. I couldn't place what it was. For some reason, I just didn't seem to be the flavor of the type that they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became this kind of tug of war, and I was really in a bad place. I had become demotivated, couldn't really understand it. I had gone from being one of the most valuable staff members they had to somebody who was on the outs and was really developing a bad attitude. And I had gotten to a place where I was certain that relatively soon either I was going to quit or they were going to fire me. And that might have been the end of my journalism career. And I can remember one Saturday morning, my dad was a member of the Middletown NAACP. And every year we used to go to their prayer breakfasts every year. And those prayer breakfasts were god awful early. They were like at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And I was a like I said, mid-20s, late 20 something guy. And at that age,
you're just
you're
getting
out
to bed.
Yeah, you're partying out, you're out late. And so I remember, calling my mom that Saturday, and I was like, I don't think I'm going to make it up for the prayer breakfast. And my mom was like, you know how much that means for your dad, for you to go with him to that thing. I don't care how late you were out, you're going to get your butt up here and you're going to go with him that morning.
Yeah.
And so I went. And it just so happened that the keynote speaker at that prayer breakfast was a guy by the name of David Goodwin. You know David well.
I know David Goodwin,
he
yes.
was he was the new editor of the Middletown Journal, my hometown paper at that particular time. And Vivian Washington, who was a good friend of mine and who was the head of the NAACP at that time, introduced me to David prior to his speech that morning. And Vivian had long wanted me to come back to the Journal, and I was telling him, I just don't think that's going to happen. I make pretty good money at the Enquirer. The Journal can't afford to bring me back, all that kind of stuff. This ain't going to happen. And so Vivian introduced me to David, and David and I talked for about 3 minutes. I mean, not even anything significant. It's sort of like, hey, I'm Kevin Aldridge. I work at the Enquirer. David Goodwin, new Enquirer or new Journal editor, blah, blah, blah. That was the extent of it. I didn't see David again anymore until 2 months later. He called me and said, hey, I'm making some changes in the newsroom here, and I want to see if you might be interested in coming back to Middletown and being my city editor. Now, Mike, what David didn't know at this time is I was at that precipice. I was on that precipice of either walking out or I was certain they were going to fire me.
Yeah.
And the timing of that, was just uncanny. And of course, I wound up getting the job. My career took an incredible turn working for Cox. I got a lot of promotions, did a lot of really great things. And lo and behold, 10 years after I was almost unceremoniously run out of the Enquirer, guess who came back and asked me and were asking me to come back and assume a leadership job at the Enquirer, a place that just 10 years earlier didn't want me at all. And so I tell that story to say that's just one of many examples that I could tell about how, in my mind, that's nothing but God. How do you have a 2 or 3 minute conversation with a guy who didn't know me from Adam turn into a job that changes the trajectory of my career? I almost went from being out of journalism. I could be selling insurance or, credit card services or something right now, but for the grace of God. And so, it's those sorts of things that I say to people, that when you develop a relationship with God and you have that experience, there are things that happen in your life that unequivocally that are nothing more than the hand of God and favor on your life. And I try to encourage people to get to know God, because I know once they do, they'll have those very similar experiences that they'll look back on and be grateful that they made the decision.
All right. Well, great. Well, I think that's a good message to end on here. Kevin Aldridge, thank you for being guest number 8 on Let Me Ask You Something.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike. And this is great. I love that you're doing this, man, and doing great things. And always been proud of you and the work that you've done, and the professional that you've turned out to be. And man, just keep doing your thing.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right.